Reporting. Awaiting orders. As you wish. Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Engineering, yes, sir.
Comrade, acknowledged. Waiting order.
Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Waiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Reporting orders. Acknowledged. Waiting orders. Present at once.
Comrade. Reporting.
Reporting. Of course.
Order.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Acknowledge. 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 Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Wait. Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Of course. Waiting.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
At once. Reporting.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Waiting order. Waiting
Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Reporting orders. Reporting orders. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Very well.
Unit lost.
Waiting
sir.
affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Waiting acknowledge.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting acknowledge.
Reporting. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Structure captured.
Yes, sir.
Order. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Comrade. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Waiting order. Comrade. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Comrade. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reaching out into other worlds.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Comrade. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Mission failed.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Comrade. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Mission failed.
Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative. Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Waiting order. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative. Comrade. Reporting. Waiting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Timer started.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Waiting
10
order. Affirmative.
minutes remaining.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Affirmative.
Ready and waiting.
Comrade.
Report. Awaiting orders.
Yes,
Waiting
sir.
order.
Comrade.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Awaiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Await.
Waiting order.
Awaiting. I'm on course. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Very well.
Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Affirmative.
As you wish.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Reporting order. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Warning, 5 minutes remaining.
Comrade. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Comrade.
Warning,
Affirmative.
4 minutes remaining.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Waiting order. Affirmative.
Reporting. Ready and waiting. Acknowledged.
Waiting
Yes, sir.
orders. Waiting order.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Waiting orders. As you wish. Reporting. Affirmative.
Warning,
Yes, sir.
3 minutes remaining.
Waiting. Comrade. Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Warning, 2 minutes remaining.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Wait. Wait. Affirmative. Wait.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Affirmative.
Warning,
Affirmative.
1
Acknowledged.
minute remaining.
Acknowledged. 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 Yes, sir. Orders. Affirmative.
Timer stopped.
Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Yes, comrade. Affirmative. Yes, comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Comrade. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Waiting order. Waiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Mission accomplished.